Much of the news cycle right now is focusing on President Obama's relationship with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. But there are some worrying signs in Israel and the surrounding neighborhood that we want to talk about now. Joining me is Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
So we know that there was this artillery shelling that killed a few Israeli soldiers in the Golan Heights. People are pointing to the tensions that seem to be rising there as a result of this. There's also, of course, the targeting of Netanyahu's two children that was on this Iranian government-affiliated website. You seem to, from what I understand, to say that because things are such a mess for Hezbollah inside of Syria, they're not going to turn their fire towards Israel, at least not right now. Walk us through this a bit.
Sure. Well, I think there's two factors right now that are probably preventing Hezbollah from turning this into a full-fledged war for now. The first is that they are experiencing their own little Vietnam right now in Syria. They are fighting on behalf of the Iranians and of the Assad regime. They've been fighting there over the last 3 years. And their boys keep coming back to Lebanon in body bags. They have sustained some significant losses, and this is really not something that I think they want to double down on by tangling with the region's top military force, i.e. Israel. I think on top of that, the people back home don't want them to do that as well, and that's reason number two why they wouldn't get involved, is that it would drag the Lebanese population into war yet again, sustain lots of damage. Billions of dollars worth of reconstruction is what happened last time. They don't want to see it again. So they're a little bit handcuffed for now, but I still see some very dangerous developments.
But so just to be clear, that means then for Hezbollah, the fight to prop up a Shia Alawite dictator in Syria and to prop up his regime, that takes precedence over fighting Israel, fighting the Zionist entity, as they call it. That's where it is. So that's fight number one then in Syria, not the fight against Israel. That seems to sort of hurt their jihadi credentials in the region.
Well, that's right, and it's made Hezbollah somewhat unpopular over the last several years in the Arab world because, there is no way that they can justify fighting on behalf of the Assad regime, killing, Sunnis, mowing them down in the streets, killing Palestinians, for that matter, on behalf of the Assad regime. This is really not burnishing their credentials a whole lot, and so they have come under fire in the same way that the Iranians and the Assad regime have from all of the Gulf Arab states and elsewhere. There's a lot of discontent with Hezbollah right now.
But now, from your first answer, you seem to leave open not just the possibility, but the likelihood that Hezbollah does want another war with Israel, right? So what would be the factors, what would be the situations that would have to come into play for there to be another Israeli-Hezbollah war, IDF-Hezbollah war?
Well, you have to take a look at what prompted this most recent outbreak of violence. The Israelis had identified senior Iranian leaders and senior Hezbollah leaders operating in the Golan Heights, on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. The Israelis took them out with a drone strike. They were somewhat quiet about it in the beginning, but as information continued to leak out, it's now our understanding that Hezbollah and Iran were trying to create a forward base in Syria where they could attack Israel, have that offensive capability to attack Israel with advanced rockets. In other words, what they're trying to do right now is to exploit the vacuum in Syria, where they don't have the problem of answering to the Lebanese people, and where really no one knows what's going on in Syria. There's utter chaos over there right now.
So they set up a launch pad in Syria, which is an ungoverned space, essentially in the midst of a civil war, and they don't have to worry about the Lebanese government saying, you're bringing blowback on us by firing into Israel here. If they do it from Syria, it's Syria's problem, and who really are you going to complain to in that circumstance?
That's right. And so now what we're looking at is a war that's going to probably take place between Israel and these actors in Syria, where every time Israel finds someone who's setting up these offensive capabilities, they're going to try to take them out. It'll be a game of whack-a-mole, but the Israelis have to be very careful because they don't want to get drawn in to that broader Syrian civil war where you've got the Nusra Front and you've got ISIS and all these other various Sunni fighting groups. They're really only targeting Hezbollah and Iran, and they need to be very careful about getting dragged in.
If I could just shift gears a little bit, there has obviously been a lot of coverage of the Netanyahu invitation to speak and whether it is a slap in the face to the administration, whether Congress overstepped their bounds. In the background of all of that is, of course, Iranian nuclear pursuit and whether the administration's continued negotiations are going to bear fruit in some capacity. How do you see that playing out? And also, how do the Israelis, do you think, how are they preparing for a situation where there's some deal struck that isn't really much of a deal at all?
Well, that's really the point here, and that's why Netanyahu, I think, wanted to get that invitation to Congress to make his case to the American people, because he does now feel that the administration is pursuing a deal that will ultimately not stop Iran from becoming a turnkey nuclear program. In other words, they're going to maintain a number of elements within that program that would allow them over the course of a few weeks to perhaps a few months to be able to make a dash for a nuclear weapon. And so while you may have a pause on it for now, that's not very reassuring to the Israelis because, of course, the Iranians continue to threaten to wipe Israel off the map.
Now, there was a time when we would hear pretty regularly about a at least reported imminent Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear reactors. That talk seems to have died down for quite a while now. Do you think that we've reached a point, or the international community, whether it realizes it or not, the U.S., Israel, and everybody else, has reached a point where strikes actually aren't even going to do it? Or why has there been that change in tone? Is it just because the U.S. has given top cover by engaging these negotiations, and so the Israelis don't want to seem bellicose by talking about strikes? Is that still, you think, in the background, or have we reached the point of no return on a strike on the reactors?
Look, it's a great question, and I think the answer is essentially that as long as the P5+1 is negotiating, the Israelis are not going to want to butt up against the international community when they believe that they could potentially stave off a war. I think on top of that, I think the Israelis have probably come to realize that it may be just mowing the lawn if they go in and take out some of these elements of the Iranian nuclear program, that ultimately the Iranians, because of the know-how that they've developed, they would only be a matter of a year or two before they're able to get right back to where they were. In the meantime, the Israelis are involved in a long-term war. The last point that I would make on this is that the Israelis just simply don't have some of the armaments and the delivery systems for the weapons that would be needed to take out the most key elements of that Iranian nuclear program. I think they wanted the United States to provide it, but from everything that we're picking up, the Obama administration has said no. Now,
if I could have you sitting in the room with the Obama administration, President Obama, and whoever's negotiating on his behalf with the mullahs on this one, what would a good deal look like? If we're going to have this negotiation, these discussions ongoing, what would have to be in place for those of us who have been very critical of what Obama's been doing recently to say, okay, this is actually a deal that we can live with for now? What would that look like?
Look, the deal would essentially mean that Iran would not be able to make a dash for a nuclear weapon. So what you do is you don't just keep oxidizing the uranium that is being enriched, but you ship it out. You stop allowing Iran to continue to install new centrifuges. You don't allow them to get advanced centrifuges. You actually start to pare down on that program. If the Iranians insist that they need to have a nuclear program for energy or for medical research, well, then let's help them build one that meets our standards. But the debate right now is essentially shifted to what Iran has a right to maintain. And every time we turn around, it looks like the scales have tipped toward the Iranians further. It looks like we continue to erode our own red lines, and that's essentially the problem we're dealing with today.
Do you think that there are at least some senior officials in the administration, without specifying who they might be, that ultimately aren't that uncomfortable with the idea of Iran actually having breakout capability, figure that there'll be nuclear parity in the Middle East? Israel has a nuclear weapon. If the Iranians have one, what difference does it really make?
Look, we've heard this over and over again, that it's not necessarily about that nuclear balance of power, because you've got to remember that, President Obama has talked about, trying to scale back on the entire kind of nuclear balance around the world. And so I would think that this would be a black eye for him if Iran ultimately got those nukes. But the bigger question that we're asking right now is whether the administration sees Iran as a possible partner in the region. As a force for stability that could fight against ISIS, for example, or against the Nusra Front, or against other jihadis. We continue to hear that Iran has the potential to play a positive role if they would just play ball.
That's the fundamental misconception here. Jonathan, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.